Senator Rand Paul grilled the CEO of Moderna at a Senate committee hearing today about raising the price of Moderna's COVID vaccine. Let's watch some of that.
Is there a higher interest or a higher incidence of myocarditis among adolescent males 16 to 24 after taking your vaccine?
So thank you for the question, Senator. First, let me say we care deeply about safety, and we're working closely with the CDC and the FDA to
Pretty much a yes or no. Is there a higher incidence of myocarditis among boys 16 to 24 after they take your vaccine?
The data I've seen from the CDC actually shown that there's less myocarditis for people who get the vaccine versus who get COVID infection.
You're saying that for ages 16 to 24 among males who take the COVID vaccine, their risk of myocarditis is less than people who get the disease.
That is my understanding,
That
Senator.
is not true, and I'd like to enter into the record 6 peer-reviewed papers from the Journal of Vaccine, the Annals of Medicine, that say the complete opposite of what you say. I also spoke with your president just last week, and he readily acknowledged in private that, yes, there is an increased risk of myocarditis. The fact that you can't say it in public is quite disturbing.
And it's interesting there, the comparison the Moderna CEO goes to of people getting the vaccine versus getting COVID. So it might be true that the risk of myocarditis from COVID is higher than the risk of myocarditis from the vaccine. But that's not really a good comparison, because so you can get COVID, because getting the vaccine is not going to prevent you from getting COVID. It's going to maybe make the symptoms of COVID not as bad, particularly if you're in a high-risk category or an elderly category. If you're, 16, we don't actually know that it's doing all that much good for you at all. But it's not going to stop you from getting it. So you're going to face the risk of myocarditis from COVID anyway, because you're going to get it, as most people, I think, globally.
Yeah, the
have gotten
question
it at
is
this
whether
point.
or not stacking it on top of each other, where it's multiple infections or infections and boosters and vaccines and boosters, is going to increase your risk of developing myocarditis.
And if you just operate from the default that you're going to get COVID, or you're 90% likely to contract COVID over a 3.5-year period, is roughly how we think the vast majority of people have gotten it by now. That's and then once you have COVID, once you've had it, we know that does give you some protection against a future infection the way a shot does. So if you have that protection already because you had it, is it worth taking on? Now, it can be I think it's a very small risk of myocarditis, but is it worth, if you're in that age group, additionally getting vaccinated beyond that? If you're not getting that much additional protection beyond your initial infection,
especially because we're talking about a young
category that's not at
very
risk.
low risk group.
I accept that the risks here are low for all the things we're talking about, but you really can't show. And this is why I think it would have been so crazy to mandate these things for this group, which we're mostly not doing. Although I said this yesterday. College campuses in the United States, some of them are requiring additional boosters.
I mean, that's part of why this conversation is almost. I mean, the science aspect of it and what the risk reward that we're discussing is obviously relevant. But if we go just one step farther, why is it relevant? Okay, well, if it's not medically recommended, we're having a hearing about the cost and pricing of these drugs, which are being recommended by the government and by these pharmaceutical companies, and whether or not this is basically a kind of a pay-to-play situation where we're being told as a community that we might as well get this, when there are some risks, as minimal as they may be, but more importantly, when given that there's very little benefit, the real benefit here is potentially to the pockets of the Moderna CEO.
Absolutely. Which is why I'm sure he frames it that way, as that, well, it's lower than against COVID. But again, that is not a comparison that matters whatsoever in a world where breakthrough infections are pretty widespread, and over a long enough period of time, the likelihood of getting COVID is extremely high.
Yeah, I've dealt with some of these cases in my tenure as an attorney, and I found it's very interesting how trusting legal professionals are, I would say, of the pharmaceutical industry. Certain drugs in particular that are very commonly prescribed and perceived as low risk. I'm thinking of Lipitor in particular, another Pfizer drug, a cholesterol-lowering drug that basically everybody over the age of 40 is apparently on. I guess I'll find out soon enough. And, the idea is, well, if everybody's on it, if there's not really any side effects, is it really a problem if it's being overprescribed? And in one case in particular, the plaintiffs were trying to argue that it does matter because the government is enriching these companies. They brought an action on behalf of the government saying they're paying so much money for these Medicare and Medicaid payments for a drug that shouldn't be prescribed, but for the pharmaceutical company basically overestimating the cholesterol levels at which it was medically indicated for, and whether or not there was like a false claim being made there. And so in my experience, people tend to dismiss, well, if there's not a legitimate, like a big harm, if the drug isn't going to kill you, then who cares if it's overprescribed? But it's a money issue. You have to follow the money and ask yourself whether the government is enriching a company like this because nobody sees the problem. You might as well take an extra drug. It's not really going to hurt anybody. And that is fundamentally the issue here.
Yeah, we want to play a little bit more of this hearing. Let's watch more of what Rand Paul had to say to the CEO.
Do you think it's scientifically sound to mandate 3 vaccines for adolescent boys?
This is for the public health leaders to decide, Senator.
You've been advocating for it, you've been interviewed, and you've been advocating for boosters. Do you know when the myocarditis is most common among these adolescent boys? After the second dose. When I spoke with your president, he readily acknowledged in private, that maybe there ought to be a discussion whether we ought to have 1 vaccine versus 2 versus 3. If 90% of the myocarditis comes after the second dose, why don't we have a rational discussion about 1? Marty McCary, a physician from Johns Hopkins, has said exactly the same thing. It's been discussed, and yet we have this ridiculous notion from the CDC. So the CDC says, and I'll ask you this question. Let's start it as a question. Your 16-year-old's had COVID. Your 16-year-old gets better and now has recovered from COVID. You vaccinate them and they get myocarditis. Are you going to give them 2 more vaccines? Your child, give them 2 more vaccines?
I'm not a clinician. I will have to discuss.
You have children.
I do.
Have you vaccinated your children?
I have.
How many times?
3 or 4 times.
3 or 4 times.
I mean, that example is a little bit misleading because the more common fact pattern would be your kid gets COVID, they recover, they don't develop myocarditis because it's relatively rare. Do you continue to want to vaccinate them? Would you recommend a booster schedule? And if so, when? Because there is this protective effect of having gotten the vaccine. Because again, the issue is, are you going to recommend doing this thing that puts money in the pharmaceutical company's pocket without having much benefit for your child? But what do you think of this example?
No, exactly as you said. And 4 shots seems like quite. Again, I think this should be left to every family's discretion, and you don't know what other underlying health issues there are. You could have a kid who has severe obesity, for instance, is an underlying condition that many kids do have.
Or diabetes.
That makes you more likely to have a bad COVID outcome. But
respiratory
but that's a good note. That would be the initial 2 shots and a booster, and the bivalent would be 4.
I mean, I had this conversation with Dr. Vinay Prasad on my podcast a while back, and I took a lot of what he said to heart. But at the same time, his basic claim was, you have protection from having COVID, so we need to be conscious of how much we layer these things on top of each other, vaccines and COVID and vaccines and COVID. And my fundamental question is, even if I accept all of that, at some point, we believe that your protection from a vaccine lapses. That's why they recommend boosters. And at some point your protection from having COVID lapses as well. So in the same way that you could be wary of getting a bunch of boosters in a row and what the cumulative effect of that is, you can be equally wary or even more wary of getting COVID a bunch of times in a row. And so to pay so much attention to one of those outcomes and not the other seems a little sketchy to me. And when are we going to get some more certainty from the scientific community about how long either of those protective forces last? Because my decision making about booster shots in subsequent doses is highly contingent on how long me having gotten COVID last summer is actually going to protect me. And honestly, I do think that he's right that not enough study and research has been done about those kinds of things that are really decision points for your average consumer.
Right. Is it doing anything at all to protect you beyond just, either the natural, either having had it or having had some shot at some point is giving you some severe disease protection, which is useful to a lot of people.
I want severe disease protection. I really don't want us to lose sight of how in the early days of COVID, before the vaccines, people who were not in high risk categories were dying, or at least being hospitalized at high rates.
It was serious.
Well,
it was happening. Yes. It can be over.
So, and
discussed a little bit too.
That's important to know. But in the absence of that knowledge, it does start to feel like a money grab when you have people basically uncritically saying, get infinite vaccines as though there's no potential health consequences there, just like we obviously understand there's health consequences to having infinite rounds of COVID.
Indeed. Well, that was an interesting hearing. Maybe we'll play some more of that. We'll go on and we'll play more of it tomorrow perhaps, and we'll have more Rising right after this.